A crippled bomber, its vital systems shot to pieces, descends through the darkness over occupied Europe. Inside, a young pilot fights the controls, his aircraft bleeding altitude and hope. Behind him, 10 men hold their breath, their fate hinging on a single, desperate decision. The runway lies just ahead, a thin, fragile ribbon of safety in a sea of night. But the landing gear is gone, hydraulics are a memory, and 400 yards of concrete will have to be enough. This is not just a story of aviation. This is a story of calculus under fire, of instinct overriding procedure, and of one man who had to land a 30-ton machine on its belly and make it look easy. Our story begins on the night of May 12, 1944. The target, the synthetic fuel plant at Lutzkendorf, Germany. The aircraft, a B-17G Flying Fortress, serial number 42 to 97,949 of the 527th Bomb Squadron, 379th Bombardment Group, based at RAF Kimbolton in England. Her name, Patches. At the controls, First Lieutenant John Jack R. Haddock, a 22-year-old pilot from Texas. What happened on the return journey would test every ounce of his skill and courage, transforming a routine mission into a legend of survival. By the spring of 1944, the Allied bomber offensive against Germany was at its peak. The objective was clear: cripple the Nazi war machine by destroying its industrial heart. The Lutzkendorf plant was a key target, producing vital fuel for the Luftwaffe. But the Germans defended these targets with ferocious intensity. Layers of flak batteries, guided by sophisticated radar, filled the sky with shrapnel, while night fighters lurked in the darkness, waiting to pounce. The crew of Patches was not inexperienced. They were on their 17th mission, a seasoned team forged in the fire of previous raids over Berlin, Leipzig, and Schweinfurt. Yet, each mission was a roll of the dice. In the fortress with Lieutenant Haddock were co-pilot 2nd Lieutenant Robert L. Nelson, Bombardier 2nd Lieutenant William R. McLeod, Navigator 2nd Lieutenant Edward A. Field, and a dedicated team of enlisted gunners and flight engineers, Sergeants Clarence E. Dick, John D. Gaffney, William H. Kelly, Robert E. King, John H. O'Neill, and James H. Wilson. They were sons, brothers, and friends, bound together inside an aluminum shell. The mission profile was brutally standard. A long, cold flight over the North Sea, penetration into hostile airspace, the nerve-shredding chaos of the bomb run through concentrated flak, and then the arduous, vulnerable journey home, often nursing damage and wounded crew. On this night, Patches and her crew successfully delivered their payload on target, turning the Lutzkendorf facility into an inferno. But the German defenses had taken note. As the fortress joined the streaming formation for the return leg, the dice were still tumbling through the air. The initial leg out of the target area was tense but uneventful. The formation droned on through the inky blackness, the crews scanning the void for the telltale exhaust flames of German night fighters. Then, without warning, the calm shattered. At approximately 0230 hours, near the Dutch coast, a Junkers Ju-88 night fighter, its engines muffled and its radar guiding it unerringly, found Patches in the gloom. It struck from below and behind, the deadliest angle of attack. Cannon shells, 20 millimeters and 30 millimeters, ripped through the bomber's fuselage and right wing with a sound like tearing metal and thunder. The impact was catastrophic. Sergeant James Wilson, the tail gunner, reported his entire turret was shot away, the guns rendered useless. A shell exploded in the radio compartment, severing lines and starting a small electrical fire that was frantically beaten out. Most critically, multiple rounds struck the right side landing gear assembly, shearing hydraulic lines and locking the gear in a partially retracted, useless position. Fluid, dark and vital, sprayed into the slipstream. The right elevator control cables were badly damaged, making the plane difficult to trim. And the hydraulic system, which powered the brakes, the flaps, and the tailwheel lock, was draining rapidly into the night. Inside Patches, the world became a cacophony of alarm bells, shouted damage reports, and the piercing shriek of wind through new holes in the airframe. Lieutenant Haddock and his co-pilot, Lieutenant Nelson, fought to stabilize the shuddering bomber. The controls were heavy, sluggish. A quick systems check confirmed their worst fears. No brakes, no flaps, and the landing gear indicators showed a chaotic mess. The right gear was mangled, the left gear status unknown. For the next 2 hours, the crew performed miracles of improvisation. The flight engineers, SGTS, Dick and Gaffney, worked feverishly to isolate the hydraulic leaks and manually pump down what gear they could. It was a futile struggle against irreversible damage. The navigator, Lieutenant Field, plotted a direct, desperate course for the nearest friendly airfield, RAF Manston, on the southeast coast of England. Manston was known as the emergency field, equipped with long runways, crash crews, and FIDO, the fog investigation and dispersal operation, a system that could burn petrol along the runway to clear fog. They would need every advantage. As the English Channel passed beneath their wounded bird, the final assessment was delivered to Haddock in the cockpit. The verdict, a complete hydraulic failure. The main landing gears were jammed. The tail wheel was unlocked and free-swiveling. The wing flaps, crucial for slowing the aircraft on landing, were inoperative. Patches would have to land on her belly, and she would have to do it in the dark, on a runway she had never seen, with 10 lives depending on a perfect, powerless touchdown. Haddock made the call to Manston Tower. His voice, steady but edged with fatigue, crackled over the radio. "Manston, this is Airfoil Red 2. We are a damaged B-17, hydraulic system gone, gear inoperative. Request emergency landing. Belly landing. Over." At Manston, the crash alarm sounded. Fire trucks, ambulances, and rescue vehicles scrambled to their positions alongside the main runway. Foam trucks laid down a slick of fire-suppressant foam. The station commander and the control tower focused entirely on the incoming fortress. They cleared all other traffic. The runway 27, was 2,400 yards long. But for a belly landing B-17 with no brakes, it might as well have been a postage stamp. At 0445 hours, patches broke through the cloud cover over the Kent coast. Below, the crew saw the welcome sight of Manston's runway lights, stretching out into the pre-dawn gloom. But the sight brought little comfort. The runway looked impossibly short, a narrow lane between fields dotted with dangerous obstacles. Haddock began his final approach. Standard procedure was to land fast in a belly landing to maintain control, but that used more runway. He had to judge his descent angle perfectly. Too steep and he would slam into the concrete, cartwheeling the aircraft. Too shallow and he would overshoot, sliding off the far end into certain disaster. He ordered the crew to assume crash positions, braced against bulkheads, heads down, parachutes discarded to avoid snagging. In the cockpit, Haddock and Nelson performed the pre-landing ritual for a dead-stick belly landing. Fuel valves were shut off to prevent fire. All electrical systems, save for absolutely essential circuits, were powered down. The propellers were feathered to reduce drag and the risk of them digging in and flipping the plane. The silence in the aircraft became profound, broken only by the rush of wind and the pounding of hearts. The runway threshold rushed up to meet them. Haddock eased back on the yoke, flaring the aircraft just so, holding her off the concrete as long as he could to shed every possible knot of speed. Then, with a deafening, grinding shriek of rending metal, the belly of the B-17 made contact with the foam-slicked runway. A rooster tail of brilliant orange sparks, mixed with foam and concrete dust, erupted behind the skidding bomber. The sound was unholy, a scream of aluminum being scraped away, of rivets shearing, of the very skeleton of the aircraft protesting against the brutal embrace of the ground. Inside, the crew was thrown about violently, held only by their restraints, deafened by the roar, surrounded by the smell of ozone and fear. Patches was now a 30-ton sled, hurtling down runway 27 with no means of stopping. She began to yaw slightly to the right, the damaged wing wanting to dig in. Haddock corrected with opposite rudder and aileron, fighting to keep her straight. The crash crews watched, helpless, as the giant fortress slid past the 1,000-yard marker, then the 1,500-yard marker, its speed seemingly undiminished. The end of the runway loomed. Beyond it lay a drainage ditch, then an open field and a public road. At their current velocity, hitting the ditch would mean a catastrophic flip, a fireball, and almost certain death for all on board. The remaining runway was measured not in yards, but in heartbeats. In the cockpit, Jack Haddock's mind raced. He had one last, desperate card to play. He remembered the unlocked, free-swiveling tail wheel. If he could somehow force it to dig into the soft ground off the side of the runway, it might act as a pivot, swinging the aircraft around and killing its forward momentum in a controlled ground loop. It was a maneuver never described in any manual. It risked collapsing the entire tail section, but it was the only option left. With less than 400 yards of usable runway remaining, Haddock made his decision. He deliberately steered the still-sliding bomber toward the left-hand edge of the concrete. As the left wingtip threatened to dip onto the grass, he applied full right rudder and right aileron. The unlocked tail wheel, trailing behind, hit the soft, rain-soaked earth at the runway's edge. It dug in immediately. For a terrifying second, it seemed the tail would simply crumple. But the B-17's rugged construction held. The tail wheel held. Acting as a perfect pivot point, it forced the massive aircraft into a violent, skidding turn to the right. Patches pivoted nearly 90 degrees, her nose swinging across the width of the runway, her momentum dissipating not in a head-on crash, but in a sweeping, sideways slide. The belly continued to scrape along the very last feet of usable concrete before sliding onto the grass overrun. Finally, with a shudder that shook every man to his bones, the great fortress came to a complete stop. She was sideways on the runway, her nose pointed back toward the direction from which she had come, her belly torn open, but her cabin largely intact. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the smell of spilled fuel and scorched metal filled the air. Haddock's voice, cracked but urgent, broke the silence on the intercom. Everybody out.
Now. Go. Go.
Go. The crew, dazed but moving, exploded into action. Hatches were kicked open. The men tumbled out onto the grass, putting distance between themselves and the fuel-drenched wreck. The crash crews descended, foam hoses at the ready, searching for sparks or flame. There were none. Not a single fire broke out. As the dawn light crept over the airfield, the full extent of the miracle became clear. Patches was a wreck, her belly gouged open, her systems destroyed. But her fuselage was straight. Her wings were attached, and every one of her 10 crew members walked away. Some had cuts and bruises from the impact. Sergeant Wilson had minor injuries from the initial attack, but there were no serious casualties. Through a combination of impeccable airmanship, nerves of steel, and an improvised maneuver born of sheer instinct, Jack Haddock had saved them all. The aftermath was one of quiet disbelief, then growing admiration. The station commander at RAF Manston inspected the wreck and the skid marks. He measured the distance from the initial touchdown point to where Patches finally came to rest. The total ground roll was approximately 1,200 yards. But the critical distance, the length of runway Haddock had actually used to bring the aircraft under control before executing his pivot, was just over 400 yards. He had used 400 yards of runway to land a belly-up bomber with no controls. It was a feat that seasoned pilots could scarcely believe. For his extraordinary skill, coolness, and devotion to duty in the face of extreme danger, First Lieutenant John R. Haddock was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. His crew received due recognition for their discipline and courage under fire. The B-17G Patches was deemed beyond repair. Like so many of her kind, she was scrapped, her metal recycled for the war effort. But her story did not end on the scrap heap. This mission was more than a spectacular landing. It was a testament to the training, resilience, and quick thinking that defined the Allied air crews in World War II. It highlighted the vital importance of emergency fields like Manston and the brave ground crews who stood ready for the worst. Haddock's innovative use of the tail wheel as a pivot entered unofficial pilot lore, a lesson in thinking beyond the checklist when the checklist has been blown away by cannon fire. The Lutzkendorf raid itself was a strategic success, further choking Germany's fuel supply. But for the 10 men of Patches, the true victory was earned in those 2 minutes of screaming metal and sparks on an English runway, guided by a pilot who refused to accept the inevitable. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. A story where skill met luck, where procedure yielded to instinct, and where 400 yards of runway represented not a limit, but a chance to live. Subscribe to World War II Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.